The sun had long set behind the towering city skyline, casting a purple and orange hue across the streets of Mapleworth. Beneath the glow of flickering street lamps and the steady hum of distant traffic, the city's forgotten shadows came to life. In alleys where the world dared not venture, one could find remnants of discarded lives, those who had fallen through the cracks of society. One such man was Gus. Gus was a grizzled old figure, with a face weathered by time, hardship, and regret. His eyes, once vibrant and full of life, had dulled into a kind of stoic resignation. His unkempt beard and tattered clothes told a story of years spent on the streets. Once, Gus had a life full of hope, love, and purpose, but fate, cruel and relentless, had stripped him of all of it. Now, he wandered the streets, a ghost of the man he once was, surviving day to day by scavenging for food, shelter, and, above all, meaning. Each night, Gus would return to the old bridge by the river. It had become his sanctuary, a quiet refuge away from the bustling city. The sound of water rushing beneath the bridge offered a strange comfort, a reminder that life, in its infinite chaos, still flowed on. As he settled into his usual spot, a crevice beneath the bridge where he had made a small home from cardboard and worn-out blankets, Gus heard something unusual, a faint, desperate sound that cut through the night. A baby's cry. Gus froze. In all his years on the streets, he had seen and heard many things, but a baby? Here. Alone. His heart raced as he scanned the dimly lit alleyway, the sound growing louder with each passing second. He followed the cry, his feet shuffling forward despite the ache in his bones. There, tucked away behind a stack of abandoned crates, he found him, a tiny baby, no older than a few days, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. Gus's breath caught in his throat. The baby's face was red from crying, his tiny hands flailing in the cold night air. "Who in the world would leave you out here?" Gus muttered under his breath, his hands trembling as he crouched down beside the infant. The child's cries tugged at something deep inside him, a long-buried instinct Gus hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, he reached out, lifting the baby into his arms. The child's cries softened as Gus wrapped him tightly in his coat, offering whatever warmth he could muster. Gus looked around, half expecting to see someone rushing back, panicked at the realization they had abandoned their child. But there was no one, just the wind howling through the alley and the distant hum of city life. Whoever had left the baby was long gone. That night, Gus didn't return to his usual spot under the bridge. Instead, he took the baby to a small, run-down building he had discovered months ago, one of the few places in the city where he could find a semblance of shelter without being disturbed. He laid the baby down gently on a pile of old clothes he had collected and stared at the tiny figure, his mind racing. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Gus whispered, more to himself than to the child. He had never been good with kids, never imagined himself in this kind of situation. But there was something about this baby, so small, so helpless, that stirred a protective instinct deep within him. Gus had lost everything, but this child had nothing from the start. He couldn't just walk away. Not now. The days turned into weeks, and Gus found himself slowly adapting to his new role. The first few nights had been a challenge. Gus, unsure of how to care for a baby, had stumbled his way through feedings, using bits of bread soaked in water and begging for milk at nearby churches and shelters. It wasn't easy, but somehow, they managed. As the weeks passed, Gus began to notice something strange within himself, a growing sense of purpose. It was as though this tiny human had reignited a fire in his chest, one that had long since burned out. He hadn't realized just how empty his life had become until this baby gave it meaning again. He named the boy Daniel, after his own father, a man he hadn't thought about in years. Gus poured his heart and soul into caring for Daniel. He scavenged for food, begged on street corners, and did odd jobs when he could, all to ensure the baby was fed and clothed. He found a battered old stroller in a dumpster and used it to push Daniel around the city, moving from place to place in search of shelter and safety. At night, Gus would cradle Daniel in his arms, singing soft, broken lullabies and telling him stories of a world beyond the cold, harsh streets. As Daniel grew, so did the bond between them. Gus, who had once believed he was destined to die alone on the streets, now had someone, to live for. He taught Daniel everything he could about survival, about kindness, and about love. Though their life was hard, and the world around them unforgiving, Gus made sure that Daniel never felt unloved. By the time Daniel was 5, he had become a fixture of the city streets. His laughter echoed through alleyways, a bright and innocent sound in the midst of so much despair. Wherever Gus went, Daniel was by his side, his tiny hand gripping Gus's calloused fingers as they navigated the city together. Daniel was a curious and intelligent child, always asking questions about the world around him. "Papa," he would ask, his wide brown eyes filled with wonder, "why do some people have big houses and we don't?" Gus would pause, his heart aching at the innocence of the question. "Well, kiddo," he would say softly, "sometimes life just works out that way. But having a house isn't what makes a family. It's the people who love you. And I love you more than anything." That answer seemed to satisfy Daniel, at least for the moment. But as he grew older, the questions became harder to answer. Daniel noticed the way people looked at them, some with pity, others with disgust. He saw the children his age, dressed in clean clothes, running into their homes with parents who seemed so different from Gus. It was only a matter of time before Daniel began to wonder about his own past. "Papa," Daniel asked one evening, as they sat by the river watching the sunset, "where's my real family? My mom? Why don't I have a mom like the other kids?" Gus's heart sank. He had been dreading this moment for years. He looked down at Daniel, his mind racing for the right words. "You do have a mom, kiddo," Gus said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "But she wasn't able to take care of you. So I found you, and I've been your papa ever since." Daniel furrowed his brow, confusion clouding his features. "But why? Why couldn't she take care of me?" Gus swallowed hard, wishing he had a better answer. "I don't know, Daniel. Sometimes people make choices they regret. But what matters is that I love you, and I'll always be here for you." "That's never gonna change," Daniel nodded, though Gus could see the lingering questions in his eyes. The truth was, Gus had never been able to shake the thought of Daniel's mother. Why had she left him? Had she regretted it? Was she out there somewhere? Wondering what had become of her son, despite the questions that lingered in Daniel's mind, life continued as it always had. Gus and Daniel moved from shelter to shelter, relying on the kindness of strangers and the strength of their bond to get by. Daniel had a natural charm about him, and it wasn't uncommon for people to offer them food, clothes, or even a few dollars when they saw the pair on the streets. By the time Daniel was 10, he had grown into a smart, kind-hearted boy with a wild mop of curly hair and a smile that could brighten even the darkest corners of the city. He adored Gus and often called him his hero, a title that made Gus's heart swell with pride and guilt all at once. they still moved frequently, never staying in one place for too long. Gus feared that someone might question why a homeless man was raising a child, and the thought of losing Daniel terrified him. The boy was his life, his reason for pushing through the endless struggles of their harsh existence. Gus couldn't imagine a world where Daniel wasn't by his side, but life, as Gus knew all too well, had a way of taking unexpected turns. It was a bright, sunny afternoon when everything changed. Gus and Daniel were in a small park near the river, the same park where Daniel had learned to walk years earlier. The spring air was warm, and for the first time in weeks, Gus felt a rare sense of peace. He sat on a bench, watching Daniel kick a soccer ball around with a group of other kids. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and for a moment, it almost felt like they were just a normal family enjoying a day in the sun, but then, out of the corner of his eye, Gus noticed a woman standing by the edge of the park, watching Daniel. She was dressed in expensive clothes, her hair perfectly styled, and her face hidden behind large sunglasses. Something about her demeanor unsettled Gus. People often glanced at them, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of pity, but this woman's gaze was different, intense, almost desperate. Gus's instincts told him to ignore her, to turn away and focus on Daniel. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching, as if she were waiting for something. Eventually, she approached, her steps slow and hesitant. Gus tensed, his protective instincts flaring. He had dealt with plenty of strangers over the years, some kind, some not, but this woman seemed different. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "That boy, what's his name?" Gus narrowed his eyes, immediately on edge. "Why do you want to know?" he asked, his voice gruff. The woman swallowed, her hands trembling as she clutched the strap of her handbag. I think he's my son." Gus felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. His heart pounded in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Standing up from the bench, the woman removed her sunglasses, revealing tear-filled eyes. 10 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I made the biggest mistake of my life. I had a baby, but I wasn't ready. I was in a terrible place. I left him, thinking someone would find him, take care of him. But I've regretted it every single day since." Gus stared at her in disbelief, his heart hammering in his chest. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You're wrong. You can't be his mother. You left him to die on the streets." The woman's face crumpled with guilt and regret. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been searching for him ever since. And now, seeing him, I just know. He's my son." Daniel, who had noticed the strange tension between Gus and the woman, approached cautiously. "Papa?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "What's going on?" Gus's heart shattered as he looked down at Daniel. He had spent the last 10 years protecting this boy, raising him, loving him as his own. And now, this woman, this stranger, was claiming him, this woman. Gus began, his voice thick with emotion, "She says she's your mother." Daniel's eyes widened in shock, his gaze flicking between Gus and the woman. "My mother?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The woman knelt down, tears streaming down her face. "I am, sweetie," she said softly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I've been looking for you for so long. I never stopped thinking about you. Please, give me a chance to make things right." Gus stood frozen, his heart in turmoil. How could he let this happen? How could he lose the one person who had given his life meaning? He had raised Daniel. He was his father, not this woman. But as much as it pained him, Gus knew he couldn't keep the truth from Daniel forever. Daniel looked up at Gus, his eyes brimming with tears. "Papa," he whispered, "what does this mean? What do I do?" Gus knelt down beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I don't know, kiddo," he said softly, his voice breaking. "But whatever happens, I want you to know that I love you. That will never change." The woman stood, her face etched with regret and pain. "I know I've made terrible mistakes," she said, her voice barely audible. "But please, Daniel, let me try to be a part of your life. I want to know you. I want to make things right." Daniel's heart was torn. He loved Gus with all his heart. Gus had been his father, his protector, his hero. But now, standing before him was the woman who had given him life, who claimed to have searched for him all these years. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. All he knew was that his world had just been turned upside down. The days following the encounter in the park were filled with confusion and heartache. Emily, as Daniel's biological mother introduced herself, visited them regularly. She was patient, never forcing Daniel into anything, but always there, hovering at the edges of his new reality. She took Daniel on trips around the city, brought him new clothes, and showered him with gifts that Gus could never have provided. At first, Daniel was overwhelmed by it all. The sudden appearance of this woman, his mother, after all these years felt like a betrayal to Gus. Yet, as time passed, Daniel found himself drawn to her stories of the life she had built after turning her own around. Emily spoke of her regrets, how she had spent years haunted by the decision to leave him, and how she had spent every moment since searching for him. Daniel began to see glimpses of himself in Emily, in the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, in the way she spoke with the same passion for life that he had inherited from Gus. Slowly, a fragile bond started to form between mother and son, though Daniel remained conflicted about what it all meant. Gus, on the other hand, struggled in silence. Watching Daniel grow closer to Emily was a kind of pain he had never experienced before. He knew that Daniel deserved to know his mother, but the thought of losing the boy he had raised, the boy he loved as his own, was more than he could bear. One evening, after a particularly emotional day, Daniel approached Gus as they sat by the river, the same spot they had shared so many moments together over the years. "Papa," Daniel said softly, his voice hesitant. I don't know what to do." Gus looked down at Daniel, his heart heavy. "You don't have to choose, Daniel," he said quietly. "You don't have to give up one of us to have the other. I'll always be your papa, no matter what. And if you want to have her in your life, that's okay." Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes. "But I don't want to lose you." Gus pulled him into a hug, his own tears falling freely. "You won't, kiddo. You never will. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." In the months that followed, a new balance began to emerge. Emily became a part of Daniel's life, but she never overstepped her bounds. She respected the bond between Gus and Daniel, understanding that Gus had been the one who raised him, the one who had given him the love and protection she hadn't been able to. Gus, though still struggling with his own emotions, found solace in the fact that Daniel was happy. He saw the joy in his eyes when he spent time with Emily, and though it pained him, Gus knew that this was what Daniel deserved, a chance at a better life. A chance to know the woman who had given him life. As time passed, the three of them found a strange, beautiful kind of harmony. Daniel had two parents now, one who had raised him on the streets, teaching him the values of love, kindness, and survival, and one who had found him after years of searching, determined to make up for lost time. For Gus, it wasn't the ending he had imagined, but it was enough. Daniel was happy. And for a man who had spent so many years believing he had nothing left to give, that was more than he could have ever hoped for. In the end, they weren't a typical family. But they were a family nonetheless, bound not by blood or circumstance, but by the love they shared for a boy who had brought light into their darkest moments.